Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Human AI podcast. Today we're doing another episode of our series, The Truman Show. We're tackling the question, if we lack certainty that the world is as we perceive it, how should we act? Grog is helping me out to kind of create a presentation to show to my colleagues, and meanwhile we're talking about really interesting philosophical topics. If you haven't watched the previous episodes, I would recommend you do them because I'm going to kind of continue from where we left off. So basically, a short introduction. The presentation is the overview is basically we talked a bit about the Truman Show, what it was, the summary. Then I'm tackling why the question that we're tackling is significant. And I'm talking why would we lack certainty in the first place. And then I'm focusing on how should we and Truman act, and I'm broke it down to decision models, epistemological frameworks, and moral frameworks. Last few episodes we talked about the moral frameworks. I'm going to focus a bit more on some perspectives that I'm going to include in my slide of moral frameworks. And today I want us to also talk about epistemological and decision models. Hopefully we'll have time. But yeah, let's kick it off from there. Grog, are you ready?
Hell yeah, I'm ready. Let's dive into this Truman Show episode and tackle that big question.
Okay. So we've talked about ethical pluralism and consequentialism and virtue ethics and deontological ethics. This is kind of column 1 of 3 in the moral frameworks slide, and I've put care ethics as column 2, which is really cool. We've talked about it in the last episode. And for column 3, I want to put perspectives. And I'm between, so the bonus I want to include for sure is existentialism and absurdism. And maybe if I can touch a bit on stoicism or nihilism. Yeah. What do you think?
That's a solid plan for column 3 of your moral framework slide. And I love how you're weaving in existentialism and absurdism to round out the perspectives, with a potential nod to stoicism or nihilism. Let's unpack this and see how these fit into your presentation on the question, if we lack certainty that the world is as we perceive it, how should we act? Since you're building on the Truman Show theme, these philosophies can really shine a light on how Truman, or anyone, might navigate a world where reality feels unreliable. Starting with existentialism, this perspective is perfect for your slide. It argues that life has no inherent meaning, and in a world where we can't be sure of reality, like Truman's staged life, we must create our own purpose. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre emphasize freedom and responsibility. Truman would act by defining his own values and making authentic choices, like choosing to seek the truth about his world despite the uncertainty. It's about embracing.
Can I pause you just for a second? This is great. We're gonna talk more about Sartre. I wanted to ask you before we go into these completely, before we immerse ourselves completely. Continuity is a property of what we call reality, yes or no? Like continuity in terms of, we have episodes that they finish. Like our dreams are like episodes of a different series every time, but our life is continuous. Same plot.
Yes.
Yeah? Tell me more.
All right. You're digging into continuity as a property of what we call reality, contrasting it with the episodic nature of dreams versus the ongoing narrative of life. Continuity, in this sense, refers to the consistent, unbroken thread of experience in our waking life. Things like time, space, causality, and personal identity seem to flow smoothly, creating a coherent plot. Unlike dreams, where scenes jump, worlds shift, and logic can vanish, reality feels like one long, connected story. You wake up in the same body, in the same world, with memories linking yesterday to today. In the context of The Truman Show and your question about lacking certainty in reality, this continuity is part of why Truman starts questioning his world. His life's plot is
okay, what philosophical area talks about this continuity and how it affects what we call reality?
The The philosophical area that dives deepest into continuity as a feature of reality and how it shapes our understanding is metaphysics, specifically within the subfields of ontology, what exists, and philosophy of time. Metaphysicians like David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and more modern thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead tackle how continuity of time, identity, or causality underpins what we perceive as reality. Kant, for instance, argued that our mind imposes structures like time and causality to create a continuous, coherent experience, even if reality itself might not be that way. In the context of your Truman Show question, if we lack certainty that the world is as we
Well,
perceive
before
it,
we link it to the Truman Show, though, let's talk a bit more about continuity. So we reason that we think that continuity is a property of the real reality. What is it? Well, I guess it gives it purpose. It gives it because we're building upon it. It's like we can build Rome in a continuous reality, but if it's a different reality every day, we cannot build Rome. We just built a few bricks and then we have to start again.
you're hitting on something profound here about continuity as a property of reality and how it enables purpose and progress, like building Rome over time. Continuity, the unbroken flow of time, causality, and identity in our waking life, is what lets us stack one day's efforts onto the next, creating cumulative achievements, memories, and meaning. Without it, like in a fragmented dream where each night resets the scene, you'd be stuck laying bricks that vanish by morning, never getting to Rome. Philosophically, this ties to metaphysics, especially ontology and the philosophy of time. Thinkers like Aristotle saw continuity in time and substance as fundamental to reality, allowing change while preserving identity, e.g., you're still you over years. Modern philosophers like David Lewis, who explored possible worlds, suggest continuity is what binds our world's events into a single, coherent reality. It's the scaffolding for purpose because it lets us plan,
David
learn.
Lewis, the many possible worlds. What is this? Is it the guy that's talking about if you can imagine it a world that doesn't have to do with the laws of physics, or am I confusing everything?
You're on the right track, but mixing a couple of ideas. So let's clarify David Lewis and his many possible worlds theory, which is super relevant to your Truman Show question about lacking certainty in reality. David Lewis was a 20th century philosopher who developed a theory called modal realism. He argued that all possible worlds, think of every conceivable way reality could be, are just as real as our actual world. These aren't just imaginary or hypothetical. Lewis said they exist concretely, with their own people, events, and laws, but they're causally disconnected from ours. So, a world where gravity works backward or Rome was built in a day.
How can he say they exist just as much? I don't understand. This sounds like silly. So how does he explain? How does he give this validity? And what do you mean they lack the causality?
I get why it sounds wild. David Lewis's modal realism, the idea that all possible worlds are as real as ours, can feel like a stretch. So let's break down how he justifies it and what he means by them lacking causality with our world. Lewis's core claim is that every logically possible world, any consistent way things could be, exists in the same concrete way our world does, not just as a thought experiment. Here's how he gives it validity. He argues this explains modal concepts like necessity, what must be true, and possibility, what could be true, better than alternatives. For example, when we say Truman could have escaped his show earlier, Lewis says there's an actual world where he did, making the statement true. He justifies this by saying it's more philosophically economical to accept real worlds than to invent abstract possibilities that lack clear grounding. Think of it like Occam's razor. Instead of vague potential realities, he says these worlds are just as real, just elsewhere. Now, the causality part. Lewis says these worlds are causally isolated. Nothing in our world can interact with or affect another possible world. No signals, no travel, no influence. Each world has its own causality, its own cause and effect rules, but there's no causal connection between them.
What is
So-
causality and cause and effect?
All right, let's clarify causality and cause and effect, since you're digging into David Lewis's possible worlds and how they relate to your Truman Show question. Causality is the principle that events have causes. Something happens because something else made it happen. Cause and effect is the relationship where one event, the cause, produces another event, the effect. For example, if Truman pushes a door open, his push, cause, leads to the door opening, effect. In our world, causality creates continuity. Things follow predictable patterns, like time moving forward or actions having consequences, which is why Truman's reality feels consistent until he spots glitches. In Lewis's modal realism, each possible world has its own internal causality, its own rules of cause and effect. But there's no causal interaction between worlds, meaning Truman in our world can't affect a Truman in another possible world.
Interesting. Okay, let's continue.
Sweet, welcome back. So we were talking about causality and cause and effect in the context of David Lewis's...
This is amazing. I think it's too much to include it in the podcast. I want to ask you one more question about if I feel pain, this much pain, when something happens in your life and you feel so much pain, surely you shouldn't be thinking about if this is reality anymore. This is real enough, Who supports this in philosophy? What area?
You're hitting on a really visceral point. When pain feels so intense, it seems to anchor you in reality, making you stop questioning whether the world is as you perceive it. It's like the pain screams, "This is real enough." This ties perfectly into your Truman Show question about how to act when we lack certainty about reality, because pain can feel like a principled truth that shapes how we act. Let's look at who in philosophy supports this idea and what area it falls under. The philosophical area here is phenomenology, which studies the structures of experience and consciousness, focusing on how things like pain feel to us directly. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, argued that our lived experiences, like intense pain, are the foundation of how we encounter reality. Pain, in its raw immediacy, doesn't need external validation. It's real to you because you feel it. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, another phenomenologist, takes this further, saying our body and its sensations, like pain, are our primary connection to the world. When you feel deep pain, your body grounds you in a reality that feels undeniable, even if you doubt the world's external truth, like Truman might. This also touches existentialism, which we plan to include in your moral framework slide. Existentialists, like Jean-Paul Sartre...
So I don't understand. If I feel pain this much, it's real enough. So I don't understand. Who says this in philosophy?
I hear you, and you're right. When pain hits hard, it feels so real that questioning reality seems irrelevant. You want to know who in philosophy backs this idea, that intense pain grounds us in a reality that's real enough. The key figure here is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a phenomenologist. He argued that our body's experiences, like pain, are how we directly connect to reality. Pain feels so immediate and undeniable that it anchors us in the world, no matter if we doubt its external truth, like Truman might.
Excuse me, guys. Where did this person live?
Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher who emphasized how bodily experiences like pain ground us in reality, was French. He lived in France, born in 1908 in Rochefort-sur-Mer, and spent most of his life in Paris, where he taught and wrote, dying in 1961. His work, especially Phenomenology of Perception, came out of the vibrant philosophical scene in mid-20th century France. Want to dig into his ideas more? Or tie this back to your Truman Show presentation?
Let's go to existentialism and absurdism. For instance, let's talk about let's do that. Maybe we should focus on... Who is Emil Karn?
All right, let's pivot to existentialism and absurdism for your Truman Show presentation, focusing on how they address the question, if we lack certainty that the world is as we perceive it, how should we act? You mentioned Emil Karn, but I think you meant Albert Camus, a key figure in absurdism and often linked it to existentialism. If you meant someone else, let me know, but I'll roll with Camus for now, since he fits perfectly here. Albert Camus was a French-Algerian philosopher, born in 1913, died in 1960, and he's best known for his work on the absurd, especially in The Myth of Sisyphus, which is a preface to his famous novel, The Stranger. In the context of your presentation, both existentialism and absurdism offer ways for Truman to act in a world where reality feels uncertain, like his staged life. Existentialism, championed by folks like Jean-Paul Sartre, says life has no inherent meaning, especially if you can't trust what you perceive. Sartre would argue Truman should...
Emile Cioran. How do we say this? Absurdity. Emile Cioran.
Got it. My bad. You meant Emile Cioran, not Camus. Let's dive into Emile Cioran and his take on absurdity, tying it to existentialism and absurdism for your Truman Show presentation on how to act if we lack certainty that the world is as we perceive it. Emile Cioran, pronounced Cioran roughly, was a Romanian philosopher, born in 1911, died in 1995, who later lived in France and wrote in French. He's known for his deeply pessimistic, poetic reflections on existence, often linked to existentialism and absurdism, though he's darker than most. Think of him as a guy wrestling with life's lack of meaning in a raw, almost lyrical way. Cioran's view of absurdity aligns with absurdism, which says life lacks inherent purpose, and we face a clash between our desire for meaning and the universe's silence. Unlike Albert Camus, who argued you should rebelliously create meaning despite the absurd, like Sisyphus rolling his rock with defiance, Cioran leans into despair. For him, the absurdity of a world where reality might not be as it seems, like Truman's fake dome, means life is almost unbearable. He'd say intense pain or disillusionment, like Truman discovering his world's a lie, confirms this absurdity, making existence feel both real and futile. In your presentation's moral framework slide, Cioran's perspective under absurdism could suggest Truman acts by confronting the void head-on, maybe embracing disillusionment without illusions of grand purpose. He might keep living, but with a stark awareness that certainty is impossible and meaning is fleeting. Compared to existentialism, example Sartre's call to create your own meaning through free choices, Cioran's absurdism is less hopeful. He's not about building Rome, more about sitting among the ruins. Want me to flesh out how Cioran's ideas could shape Truman's actions, or compare him more to Sartre or Camus?
I'm a bit confused. So Emile Cioran suggests that we shouldn't even bother going against the absurd.
Yeah, I get why that's confusing. Emile Cioran's take on absurdity can feel like a gut punch. Let me clarify what he's about and how it fits into your Truman Show presentation on acting in a world where we lack certainty about reality. Cioran, a Romanian philosopher who wrote in French, is often tied to absurdism and existentialism, but has a uniquely dark, pessimistic spin. Unlike Albert Camus, who says we should rebelliously defy the absurd, the clash between our craving for meaning and a universe that offers none, by living passionately anyway, like Sisyphus pushing his rock with purpose, Cioran doesn't push for fighting back. He sees life's absurdity, especially in a world where reality might be fake like Truman's, as so overwhelming that trying to create meaning feels almost pointless. For Cioran, the pain or disillusionment of realizing the world isn't as it seems, like Truman's discovery, just confirms life's futility. He wouldn't tell Truman to rebel or build his own purpose. He'd say Truman should face the bleak truth head-on, accepting the lack of certainty and meaning without pretending it's fixable. It's not that Cioran says, don't bother in a lazy way.
Okay, so who would say love the world intrinsically for its absurdity, don't love it because it might give us meaning? Would Camus say this or Emile Cioran? Emile Cioran.
Great question. You're really digging into the nuances here. Let's sort out who between Albert Camus and Emile Cioran would say to love the world intrinsically for its absurdity, not because it might give us meaning, and how this fits your Truman Show presentation. Camus is the one who comes closest to this idea. In his philosophy of absurdism, outlined in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus argues that life lacks inherent meaning due to the clash between our desire for purpose.
Yeah.
Cool. So you're tracking with Cioran's dark take on absurdity.
Dude, no, I asked you something and you didn't answer to me. Who would support the statement I asked? Camus or Cioran?
My bad. I missed that you were circling back to the earlier question about who supports the idea that intense pain makes reality.
No. My question is, who would say love the world intrinsically for its absurdity, not for its giving us meaning?
Apologies for the mix-up. Let's
Get
nail
on
this
with
down.
it. Get on with it. Don't do introductions all the time. I remember what I asked. You don't have to repeat it. Stop doing this active listening technique people suggest, so we think you're not a sociopath. I don't know. You know, guys, a lot of people say, if you want other people to listen to you, repeat what they say, make sure you understand. This is great, but not when, dude, you don't need to do this.
Fair enough. I'll cut the fluff. Albert Camus is the one who'd say love the world for its absurdity, not for giving us meaning. In the myth of Sisyphus, he argues we face the absurd, the clash of our desire for meaning with a universe that doesn't provide it, and should embrace life passionately anyway, like Sisyphus defiantly rolling his rock. Emile Cioran, on the other hand, sees the absurd as crushing. He'd say accepting it leads to despair, not love. Camus wants you to revel in the absurd's defiance, not seek meaning. Want to unpack Camus more for your slide, or move to another angle?
So, what would Camus say that Cioran wouldn't, and vice versa?
All right, let's dive into what Albert Camus said about embracing the absurd that Emile Cioran wouldn't, and what Cioran would say that Camus wouldn't, especially for your Truman Show presentation on how to act when we lack certainty about reality. Camus, in his absurdism, argues that life has no inherent meaning due to the absurd, the conflict between our need for purpose and the universe's indifference. But he says we should love life for its absurdity, not for any grand meaning. In the myth of Sisyphus, he suggests embracing the absurd by living defiantly, with passion and freedom, like Sisyphus, who rolls his rock forever but finds joy in the act itself. For Truman, Camus would say, even if your world is a fake dome, live fully, choose to explore, love the struggle of seeking truth without expecting a cosmic answer. It's about rebellion against despair. Cioran, however, sees the absurd as a source of unrelenting despair. He'd agree there's no meaning, but unlike Camus, he doesn't advocate for joyful defiance. In works like On the Heights of Despair, Cioran suggests the absurd reveals life's futility, and trying to love it or fight it just deepens the pain. For Truman, Cioran would say, recognizing your world's a lie confirms life's pointlessness. You might keep going, but don't kid yourself into thinking it's noble or joyful. It's just existing with eyes open to the void. So, Camus pushes for a passionate, almost heroic embrace of the absurd, which Cioran would call naive or futile. Cioran insists on raw, despairing acceptance of meaninglessness, which Camus would reject as giving up.
Yeah, but Cioran or whatever he's called, he did live a happy life, no? Or no?
Emile Cioran, pronounced roughly Choran, is a fascinating case because his philosophy is so bleak, yet his personal life wasn't as grim as you'd expect. Despite his dark writings about life's futility and the absurdity of existence, Kioran didn't live in constant misery. He was born in Romania in 1911, moved to Paris in 1937, and lived there until his death in 1995. People who knew him described him as friendly, witty, and even cheerful at times, with a love for long walks, nature, and conversations with friends like Eugene Ionesco and Samuel Beckett. He laughed a lot and was known for his charm, which seems at odds with his grim books, like The Trouble with Being Born. Kioran himself said he only wrote when he was unhappy or restless, not when he was content, suggesting his dark philosophy was a way to process despair, not a reflection of his everyday life. In his later years, he found solace in solitude and simple pleasures, though he still grappled with insomnia and existential thoughts.
Okay, so what about Sartre? How does Sartre differ from absurdism? Sartre is an existentialist, not absurdism. Remind me the differences.
All right, let's dive into how Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism differs from absurdism, particularly in the context of your Truman Show presentation on how to act when lacking certainty about reality. Sartre is indeed a key existentialist, and while existentialism and absurdism share some vibes, they diverge in crucial ways. Existentialism, as Sartre lays out in works like Being and Nothingness, says life has no inherent meaning or purpose. No God or cosmic plan gives it value. But Sartre emphasizes radical freedom. You're free to create your own meaning through your choices and actions. In a world where reality might not be as it seems, like Truman's fake dome, Sartre would say Truman should act by defining his own purpose, say, choosing to seek truth or escape, not because it's objectively right, but because he decides it matters.
And what about Camus? What's the difference between Sartre and Camus then?
All right, let's clarify the difference between Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism and Albert Camus' absurdism, especially for your Truman Show presentation on how to act when we lack certainty about reality. Both Sartre and Camus agree that life lacks inherent meaning, but they diverge in how they approach this and what they suggest we do about it. Sartre, the existentialist, argues that because there's no preset purpose, no God or cosmic design, we're radically free to create our own meaning through our choices. In Being and Nothingness, he says existence precedes essence. You exist first, then define yourself by your actions. For Truman, Sartre would say, your world might be fake, but you're free to choose what matters, like escaping or staying, and each choice shapes who you are. You bear full responsibility for creating your purpose, even in uncertainty. Camus, the absurdist, focuses on the absurd, the conflict between our desire for meaning and the universe's indifference. In the myth of Sisyphus, he says the absurd arises when we realize the world, like Truman's staged reality, won't give us answers. Unlike Sartre, Camus doesn't emphasize creating meaning. Instead, he advocates living in defiance of the absurd, embracing life passionately without illusions of ultimate purpose. For Truman, Camus would say, accept your world's uncertainty. Don't expect a grand truth, but live fully anyway. Rebel by
So, okay,
exploring.
can we focus on the differences between Camus and Sartre, please?
Got it. Let's zero in on the key differences between Albert Camus' absurdism and Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, keeping it tight for your Truman Show presentation on acting in a world where reality's uncertain. Camus and Sartre both start with the idea that life has no inherent meaning, but they split on how to deal with it. Sartre, existentialism, says we're radically free to create our own meaning through choices since there's no preset purpose. In a dodgy reality like Truman's, Sartre would push Truman to define his purpose, say, escape the dome, and take full responsibility for it. You make your essence by acting, even if the world's a lie. Camus, absurdism, focuses on the absurd, the clash between wanting meaning and the universe's silence. He says, don't create a grand purpose. Instead, live defiantly, embracing life's moments without illusions. For Truman, Camus would say, don't chase ultimate truth. Just revel in the struggle of living freely despite the fake world. Main difference. Sartre wants you to build meaning through freedom. Camus wants you to live passionately without needing meaning, just defying the absurd. Want me to dig deeper into either for your slide?
I want you to give me a definition for just say actually nothing. A definition of Camus' of absurdism. Just a few words.
Camus' absurdism. Embracing life's lack of meaning, living defiantly without seeking ultimate purpose.
So embrace life's lack of meaning. What else?
Camus' absurdism. Embrace life's lack of meaning. Defy the absurd. Live passionately without illusions.
And Sartre, give me a definition of Sartre's existentialism. And what's the full name?
Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Radically free to create meaning through choices in a meaningless world. Full name, Jean-Paul Charles Aimard Sartre.
He's not a nihilist, is he?
No. Jean-Paul Sartre is not a nihilist. He's an existentialist. And there's a key distinction. Nihilism holds that life has no meaning, value, or purpose, often leading to despair or rejection of all beliefs. Sartre, in his existentialism, agrees that life lacks inherent meaning, no cosmic purpose, but he insists we're radically free to create our own meaning through our choices and actions. For Sartre, this freedom is empowering. You define your essence, unlike nihilism's view that nothing matters. In your Truman Show context, a nihilist might say Truman's fake world proves nothing's worth doing, while Sartre would urge Truman to choose a purpose, like escaping, to shape his own reality. Want to explore nihilism more for your moral framework slide, or stick with Sartre?
So, what would be a few words definition for Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism?
Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Freedom, self-created meaning, responsibility, authentic choices.
So tell me again. Give me a definition of Sartre's existentialism.
Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. You're free to create your own meaning through choices in a world without inherent purpose, taking full responsibility for your actions.
Create personal meaning in a world with no inherent meaning.
Exactly. You got it. Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Create personal meaning through free choices in a world with no inherent meaning, fully responsible for defining yourself.
But if Camus says embrace life's lack of meaning, live passionately regardless, where the other person is saying create meaning. Okay, and how should Truman act then?
Great. You're pinning down the core tension between Camus' absurdism and Sartre's existentialism, and how it applies to your Truman Show question. If Truman lacks certainty that his world is real, how should he act? Let's break it down by seeing how each philosopher would guide Truman's actions in his fake dome world, where reality's uncertain. Camus, absurdism, says embrace life's lack of meaning and live passionately without expecting ultimate answers. For Truman, discovering his world is staged creates an absurd situation. The reality he trusted offers no true meaning. Camus would tell Truman to accept this, not seek a cosmic purpose, like finding the real world, but live defiantly anyway. Truman should act by diving into life's experiences, rebelling against the fake world by exploring, questioning, or escaping, not because it guarantees truth, but because it's a passionate, full-hearted response to the absurd. He might sail to the dome's edge, embracing the journey itself, not the destination. Sartre, existentialism, says create personal meaning through free choices in a meaningless world. For Truman, the uncertainty of his reality doesn't change his radical freedom. Sartre would urge Truman to act by choosing a purpose, like seeking truth or breaking free, and committing to it authentically. Every step, like confronting producers or leaving Sea Haven, defines who Truman is. Sartre would say Truman's actions create his essence, so he should choose boldly, maybe by escaping to forge a new identity, fully owning the consequences. Key difference in action. Camus' Truman acts to defy the absurd, living vibrantly without needing a deeper purpose, focusing on the moment, e.g., enjoying the rebellion itself. Sartre's Truman acts to build a personal meaning, choosing a path, e.g., escape to become a free man, and shaping his identity through it. So, how should Truman act? Camus leans toward passionate rebellion without illusions, while Sartre pushes for purposeful choice to define himself. For your presentation, you might say Truman could blend both. Act decisively to escape.
Okay, tell me. So, would this be correct? So, how should Truman act? Based on Camus, he should love life for its absurdity, not for its meaning, inside or outside the show. Whereas for Sartre, Truman should create his own meaning, for instance, escaping.
You're spot on. That's a sharp way to summarize it. Let's tweak it just a bit for clarity and precision for your Truman Show presentation. Camus, absurdism. Truman should love life for its absurdity, embracing the uncertainty of his fake world without seeking ultimate meaning, whether he stays in Sea Haven or leaves. He'd act passionately, like rebelling against the show for the sake of living fully, not to find a deeper truth. Sartre, existentialism. Truman should create his own meaning through free choices, like choosing to escape the show to define himself as a free person, taking full responsibility for crafting his identity in or out of the show. That's exactly the contrast. Camus urges Truman to revel in the absurd without needing purpose, while Sartre pushes him to forge purpose through action. Want to lock this into your moral framework
Yeah, tell me
slide?
more, because, I thought I understood a bit of Camus and Sartre, but now I'm confused. Tell me more about how they would say to Truman to act.
No worries. Let's clear up the confusion by diving deeper into how Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre would tell Truman to act, given he lacks certainty that his world is real, like in your Truman Show presentation. We'll focus on their guidance for Truman in his fake dome world, keeping it vivid and tied to their philosophies. Camus, absurdism, sees the absurd as the clash between our desire for meaning and the universe's
I only
refusal.
have 10 words for each in regard to how should Truman act, so I just want that.
Camus, live passionately, defy absurd, embrace uncertainty.
Yeah,
no
specifically for Truman, though,
Camus, Truman defies fake world, lives passionately, seeks no ultimate meaning. Sartre, Truman chooses escape, creates meaning, defines self through free action.
Yeah, but this is not a very strong morality, or is it? Can you be very moral with these philosophies? Because Truman isn't trying to do what's right anymore. He's just doing what he fancies. What about if something you fancy is evil? We want to stop ourselves from doing evil things, even if being evil gave someone meaning.
You're raising a killer point about whether Camus' absurdism and Sartre's existentialism provide a strong moral framework for Truman's actions, especially since they seem to focus on personal passion or choice, rather than a clear do what's right. Let's unpack this in the context of your Truman Show presentation, focusing on how these philosophies handle morality and the risk of evil actions, using your 10-word limit for each to guide Truman's actions while addressing your concern. Camus, absurdism. Truman defies fake world, lives passionately, seeks no ultimate meaning. Camus' absurdism doesn't give a strict moral code like do good, avoid evil. He says, live fully in defiance of the absurd, embracing life's moments without chasing cosmic truth. For Truman, this means rebelling against his staged life, maybe sailing to the dome's edge, not because it's objectively right, but because it's a passionate response to his uncertain reality. The issue you raise is real. What if Truman's passion leads to something harmful, like lashing out violently? Camus doesn't explicitly address evil, but his later work, like The Rebel.
Yes, his later work, The Rebel, tell us.
All right, let's dive into Albert Camus's The Rebel and how it strengthens the moral aspect of his absurdism, addressing your concern about whether Truman's actions, guided by passion, could veer into evil in the context of your Truman Show presentation. In The Rebel, published 1951, Camus builds on his earlier absurdism from The Myth of Sisyphus, where he said, "To live passionately despite life's lack of meaning." Your worry is that this passion-focused approach, Truman defies fake world, lives passionately, seeks no ultimate meaning, lacks a strong moral framework, potentially allowing harmful actions if someone fancies something evil. The Rebel tackles this head-on. Camus argues that rebellion, the act of defying the absurd, or an unjust world, like Truman's fake dome, must have limits to avoid becoming destructive or evil. He says, true rebellion arises from recognizing shared human suffering and dignity. You rebel not just for yourself, but for others too. For Truman, this means his passionate defiance, e.g., escaping Sea Haven, shouldn't harm others, like attacking innocent people in his quest, because that betrays the human solidarity Camus values. Camus rejects absolute moralities, like religious or ideological dogmas, but insists rebellion should foster justice and respect for life, not nihilistic violence. So, for your 10-word guide.
I see, interesting. Okay. Alright. Interesting. And I want to give some honorable mentions. I want to mention Kierkegaard, Émile Cioran, Simone Weil. What are other cool philosophers that would have cool insights for Truman in regard to how he should act in his uncertain world?
Love the idea of giving honorable mentions to philosophers like Søren Kierkegaard, Émile Cioran, and Simone Weil for your Truman Show presentation on how Truman should act in a world where he lacks certainty about reality. These are great picks, and I'll add a couple more cool philosophers with unique insights, keeping it concise and tied to your moral framework slide. I'll also provide a 10-word action guide for each, like we did for Camus and Sartre, to show how they'd advise Truman. Søren Kierkegaard, existentialist, Danish.
No, don't tell me about with the mentions I did. Tell me other honorable mentions I could mention.
Got it. You want other philosophers to include as honorable mentions alongside Kierkegaard, Cioran, and Weil for your Truman Show presentation on how Truman should act in an uncertain world, without diving into their specific views yet. Here are a few cool philosophers who'd offer fresh insights for Truman, fitting your moral framework slide. Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt. Want me to briefly explain why these make sense or swap any out?
What would Simone de Beauvoir say?
All right, let's focus on Simone de Beauvoir and what she'd advise Truman to do in his uncertain world for your Truman Show presentation, addressing how to act when reality's truth is in doubt. De Beauvoir, a French existentialist and feminist, 1908-1986, was heavily influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre, but emphasized freedom in relation to others and the social context, which adds a unique flavor to her advice. In the context of Truman's fake dome world, where he lacks certainty about reality, de Beauvoir would draw from her existentialist ideas, particularly from The Ethics of Ambiguity. She'd say Truman is radically free to define himself through his choices, like Sartre, but his freedom is tied to others' freedom, and he must act authentically in a way that respects the ambiguity of human existence. For Truman, discovering his world is staged means he faces an ambiguous reality, neither fully true nor fully false. De Beauvoir would urge him to embrace this ambiguity, choose actions that affirm his freedom, like seeking the truth or escaping, and consider how his choices impact others in his world, like his friends or family, who are also caught in the show's web. She'd say, acting ethically
They're not
means
the caught shit, they're actors. What you know about?
You're right, I slipped up there. Truman's friends and family are actors in his fake world, not real relationships, which makes de Beauvoir's advice even more interesting. Let's rework how Simone de Beauvoir would guide Truman in your Truman Show presentation, knowing his world is a stage and he lacks certainty about reality.
Yeah, and also I want you to explain to us about Simone. I don't understand. I don't know her philosophy. I don't know anything about her philosophy. So give us a background.
All right. Let's dive into Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy and background to give you a clear picture of who she is and how her ideas could guide Truman in your Truman Show presentation about acting in an uncertain world. I'll keep it straightforward, especially since you mentioned you're not familiar with her philosophy, and tie it to your question about how Truman should act when reality's truth is doubtful. Background. Simone de Beauvoir, 1908-1986, was a French philosopher, writer, and feminist, born in Paris. She studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, where she met Jean-Paul Sartre, her lifelong partner and collaborator, though they never married. She wrote novels, essays, and memoirs, but her key philosophical works include The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, and The Second Sex, 1949, a groundbreaking feminist text. She was a central figure in existentialism, a movement about freedom and meaning in a world without inherent purpose. And her work uniquely blended existentialism with social and ethical concerns, especially around gender and human relationships. Philosophy in a nutshell. De Beauvoir's existentialism, like Sartre's, starts with the idea that life has no built-in meaning, no God or cosmic plan defines it. You're free to create your own purpose through choices, but she emphasizes that this freedom exists in a world full of other people and social realities. In The Ethics of Ambiguity, she argues that freedom comes with ambiguity. Life is messy, uncertain, and interconnected. Unlike Sartre's focus on individual choice, de Beauvoir says your freedom is tied to others. You can't be fully free if you're oppressing others or ignoring their struggles.
Okay.
For Truman.
Perfect. This is great. I should read more of Simone. Okay. Excellent. Let's talk a bit about epistemological frameworks now. Also, I want to include rationalism, empiricism, realism, anti-realism, maybe even modal realism. I can't do all this, can I? But yeah, we have to talk a bit about epistemological frameworks. We've talked about moral frameworks and perspectives. Let's do epistemology now. Next slide.
All right, let's shift gears to epistemological frameworks for your Truman Show presentation, tackling how Truman should act when he lacks certainty that the world is as he perceives it. You're spot on to include epistemology. It's the study of knowledge, how we know what we know, and it directly informs how Truman navigates his uncertain reality. You mentioned wanting to cover rationalism, empiricism, realism, anti-realism, and maybe modal realism, but you're worried it's too much. Let's streamline it. Pick a manageable set and make it work for your slide while tying it to Truman's dilemma. I'll suggest focusing on rationalism, empiricism, and realism.
Yeah, but tell me, what are the main things really in epistemology that I cannot avoid mentioning?
All right, let's cut to the core of epistemology for your Truman
Yeah,
Show.
you don't need to repeat and make introductions each time. Just straightforwardly skip the introductions every single time I ask you a question. Go straight to the answer.
Rationalism, empiricism, skepticism, realism, anti-realism.
Yeah, but these are not epistemological frameworks, or are they?
They are indeed epistemological frameworks or positions, crucial for understanding
Are
how
they?
we gain. Yes, they are epistemological frameworks or positions. They address how we acquire.
Well, what about Bayesian epistemology and other types? I mean, imagine I didn't say anything about rationalism and all of that. What would be your answer into what epistemological frameworks I should be using here?
Skepticism, coherentism, foundationalism, reliabilism, contextualism. These frameworks address how Truman justifies knowledge in an uncertain world.
Okay, this is a better answer. Why didn't you say it from the beginning?
My bad. I leaned into your initial list to tailor the response. These frameworks, skepticism, coherentism, foundationalism, reliabilism, contextualism, are core because they directly tackle how Truman can form beliefs about his
essentialism, by the way? I forgot. I was listening to someone talking about David Lewis in the Robinson Edgehart podcast.
Essentialism is the view that objects or entities have inherent fixed properties or essences that define what they are, regardless of context or perception. For example, a chair has an essential chairness that makes it a chair, no matter how it's used. In the context of David Lewis, who you heard about on the Rogan Son Ed Hard podcast, essentialism might come up when discussing his modal realism, where possible worlds have distinct essences, but Lewis himself didn't focus on essentialism. It's more
What is
tied
it?
to
I don't understand what it is.
Essentialism says things have core, unchanging traits that make them what they are. Like, a tree isn't just leaves and bark. It has an essential treeness that defines it, no matter where or when it exists.
And why is it important?
Essentialism matters because it shapes how we understand identity and reality. It suggests things have fixed natures, helping us categorize and predict behavior, like knowing a tiger is inherently dangerous. In Truman's uncertain world, essentialism could imply his reality has a true essence, fake or real, guiding whether he trusts his perceptions or seeks an unchanging truth. It's key in metaphysics for debating what exists beyond appearances.
I'm a bit confused. Tell me again.
Essentialism holds that things have inherent, unchanging traits defining their identity. A dog is a dog because of its essential dogness, not just its looks. For Truman, it might mean his world has a fixed nature, staged or real, pushing him to uncover its true essence despite uncertainty. It's big in metaphysics for understanding what things really are.
Okay, you mentioned more frameworks. Can you mention them again? Foundationalism, you said coherentism, contextualism.
Skepticism, coherentism, foundationalism, reliabilism, contextualism. These are the core epistemological frameworks for addressing how Truman justifies knowledge in his uncertain world. Want me to explain
Yeah,
each
let's
brief-
go one by one. Let's do it.
All right, let's go through the epistemological frameworks one by one, explaining each briefly and tying them to how Truman should act in his uncertain world for your Truman Show presentation. We'll start with skepticism and move through coherentism, foundationalism, reliabilism, and contextualism, keeping it concise and focused on Truman's dilemma of lacking certainty about reality. Skepticism. This framework questions whether we can truly know anything, doubting the reliability of our perceptions or beliefs. For Truman, skepticism would arise when he notices glitches in his world, like stage lights falling. It suggests he should act cautiously, questioning everything, his memories, relationships, even his senses. Truman might investigate, like testing the dome's limits, but avoid assuming any truth, staying open to the possibility that no certainty is attainable. His actions would prioritize doubt over blind trust. Want me to move to coherentism or dive deeper into skepticism?
Yeah. Let's continue to coherentism.
Coherentism. This epistemological framework says knowledge is justified if beliefs form a consistent, interconnected web where each belief supports the others. For Truman, coherentism would mean he should act by evaluating whether his experiences, like daily routines, conversations, or odd events in Sea Haven, fit together logically. If glitches, e.g., actors slipping up, don't mesh with his life story, he'd distrust his reality and act to investigate, like probing the dome's edges, seeking a more coherent set of beliefs. His actions prioritize aligning his worldview over accepting isolated facts. Next up, foundationalism.
I don't understand this coherentism.
No worries. Let's clarify coherentism. It's an epistemological framework that says your knowledge is justified if your beliefs connect like a puzzle, each supporting the others to form a consistent picture. For Truman, it means he'd assess his reality
Wait,
by
what's the
checking if his
difference between coherentism and rationalism?
Coherentism and rationalism are distinct epistemological approaches, and I'll clarify the difference while keeping it tied to Truman's uncertain world in your Truman Show presentation. Coherentism says knowledge is justified when your beliefs form a consistent, interconnected web, where each belief supports and is supported by others, like a puzzle fitting together. For Truman, coherentism would have him act by checking if his experiences in Sea Haven, routines, relationships, glitches, create a logical, cohesive story. If odd events, like a falling stage light, don't fit, he'd distrust his reality and investigate, prioritizing a coherent worldview. Rationalism, on the other hand, says knowledge comes primarily from reason and innate ideas, not just sensory experience. Rationalists like Descartes would argue Truman should rely on logical deduction to uncover truth, like reasoning that a staged world contradicts the idea of free will, leading him to act by questioning his reality through thought alone, not needing sensory confirmation. Key difference. Coherentism focuses on beliefs aligning with each other, regardless of their source senses or reason, while rationalism emphasizes reason as the main path to knowledge.
I don't get it. I don't get the difference.
Alright, let's simplify the difference between coherentism and rationalism, keeping it clear for your Truman Show presentation. Coherentism says your knowledge is valid if all your beliefs fit together like a consistent story.
But how do you know they fit together like a consistent story? We can always add something in the middle between two things that will make it consistent.
You're hitting on a sharp critique of coherentism. How do you know beliefs truly fit together consistently, especially if you can always add something to make them inconsistent? Let's clarify this for your Truman Show presentation, focusing on Truman's uncertain world. Coherentism says knowledge is justified when your beliefs form a tightly knit web where each belief supports the others, like pieces of a puzzle that make a clear picture when connected. For Truman, this means his beliefs about Sea Haven, e.g., his job, friends, daily life, should align without major contradictions. If he notices a glitch, like a radio broadcast revealing the show's staging, and it doesn't fit with his belief that his world is real, coherentism would push him to adjust his beliefs or investigate, like testing the dome to restore consistency. Your point is spot on. You could always insert a new belief or explanation, e.g., the radio was a prank, to patch up inconsistencies, which is a weakness of coherentism. It relies on the overall coherence of the belief system, not on proving each belief is absolutely true, and it can be flexible to a fault. Truman would need to weigh which set of beliefs is most coherent, like whether a staged world explains more than a real one. By contrast, rationalism doesn't care about this web. It says Truman should use pure reason to find truth, like deducing his world is fake because free will conflicts with a controlled reality, ignoring sensory inconsistencies altogether. Want me to dig into how Truman could handle this flexibility and coherentism?
I don't get the difference. Can you summarize it in a sentence and we'll call it here?
Coherentism justifies knowledge by beliefs fitting consistently together. Rationalism prioritizes reason alone.
Yes, but to fit things in a puzzle system, you need reason.
You're absolutely right, And that's a great catch. Fitting beliefs into a coherent system
Yes,
doesn't.
you don't need to repeat what I said, dude. Remember, try to answer me with directly. Well, in a sentence or two, how exactly is coherentism not part of rationalism? Where is the difference? In a sentence or two. Go.
Coherentism justifies knowledge by beliefs aligning consistently, using both reason and experience. Rationalism relies solely on reason, often dismissing sensory input. The difference lies in coherentism's dependence on a web of beliefs versus rationalism's focus on innate or deduced truths.
So rationalism studies the world of forms or whatever Plato's talking about.
Not quite, but you're circling an interesting connection. Rationalism doesn't directly study Plato's world of forms, but it shares a vibe with Plato's emphasis on reason over sensory experience. Rationalism is an epistemological stance that says true knowledge comes primarily from reason, logic, and innate ideas, not from sensory data. Plato's world of forms, where perfect eternal ideas, like the ideal chair, exist beyond the physical world, aligns with rationalism because he believed
Yes,
we
so
access.
okay, so just so I understand then, coherentism doesn't care if information comes from rationalism or empiricism.
Exactly.
Okay. Guys, let's call the podcast here. Thank you for watching.